And Dickinson at that time, were there only 2 law schools in Pennsylvania then, or were there more than 2 at that time?
I think, well, there was Dickinson and the University of Pennsylvania. Of
Did
course,
Pitt-
Widener wasn't here, and Pitt has a law school, so they were in business, I think, at that time.
But Temple did not have a law school yet?
You know, I'm not really sure about that. I don't know.
I don't think they did, but Dickinson obviously was the prime law school for the central Pennsylvania
Absolutely, yes.
area.
Yes.
And do you have any specific memories of law school in those days? Do you think it's much like today or different?
I think it must be different from what I'm hearing. You know, it was strictly lecture-type classes, but they're doing so much more with practice, information, and I just don't know exactly what more they're doing, but I know it's not what it used to be.
When I went to law school in the 70s, they particularly scheduled classes so we couldn't work. They wanted us only to focus on our classes. And maybe did you go in the 50s to law school?
I graduated in '51.
Okay, and then after that, you began practicing right away?
Mm-hmm.
Did you go in with your father?
I did.
And what kind of law did your practice
A very
handle?
general practice.
Which was typical then.
Basically, most anything that walked in the door.
And how many lawyers were in the firm?
4.
But most firms then were just a general practice as
Oh, yeah,
opposed to,
absolutely. As opposed to what they are today, indeed.
they seem very specialized.
Yeah.
And what kind of cases did you enjoy the most as a lawyer?
Well, I can't say that I enjoyed one more than the other. We did we did litigation. We wrote wills. We searched titles. You know, the usual general practice things.
But did you have time slips, or did you generally
No.
bill just based on the job?
We did not have time slips. And depending who the client was, we could do it 2 different ways. Wait till the case is over, or get a retainer up front, which was preferred. And if we were successful, we might get, you know, if it was contingent fee, we'd get a little more at that point if we settled the case.
So when did you run for judge then? You ran as a trial court judge in Dauphin County Court first, is that right?
I did. 1969.
And did you decide to run for judge, or were you asked by someone
I was
to run?
I was encouraged to run, and the people that encouraged me, I don't want to use names, but they were involved in Republican affairs, and I said, sure, I'll give it a shot. So that's how that came about.
Was it common for sometimes the leaders of the party to decide who they would like to run for judge?
Absolutely. It was totally dependent on the leader. I think Bob Smith was the chairman of the Dauphin County Republicans when I ran. And of course, before that, trying to think who it was.
Well, Harvey Taylor was pretty involved.
Well, Harvey Taylor, of course, yeah. So if he was involved in it, you know, he controlled it. So, and I knew Harvey, you know, very inferentially, but Bob Smith was the chairman, and he indicated he would support me. And a couple other lawyers thought I should do it, so I decided to do it.
In those days, it probably did not involve the fundraising that it involves today to run for office, but including a judicial spot.
There was no such thing as fundraising. Well, I mean, I guess there was a little, but not the way it is today. In fact, I guess it wasn't considered unseemly to try to raise money, but nobody did so much because the Republican Party controlled everything. You didn't have to worry too much about the election. So,
Going back to when you practiced law back then, did you feel it was a more congenial way to have a career? In other words, were lawyers more like friends than adversaries?
absolutely. I was thinking about that the other day. I think when I graduated from law school, there were, I don't know, 200, no, I counted it one day. The bar was very small. I think it was 2,000. Now it's what, 16 or 18,000. And we did much more socializing then, and had a lot of very close friends, among the other judges. So,
And you would have nice long lunches together?
well, we were invited to join the round table, which we did. I did think they spent more time then than I remember recently.
Well, tell us about the round table.
Well, my understanding is that it really began, in fact, there's been a history, maybe you've seen it.
Yes.
I don't remember names anymore because I didn't know the people, but it was started by a couple businessmen, I think, got it started. Eventually, they got the judges and some lawyers. In the old days, there weren't too many lawyers, but when I was there in those years, I think there were 3 or 4 lawyers plus the judges. So, excuse
And
me.
it's my understanding that the group first actually had lunch together at a location where there was a round table.
Yeah,
And so they decided to call themselves the
round table.
The round table.
That was in the Penn Harris Hotel.
And that was quite an important meeting place for lawyers and businessmen and judges back in the 50s,
Yeah.
60s.
Mhm. Oh, it was indeed. There was a gang that made the Esquire their anchor, and they'd meet there a couple times a week. And
At lunch and after work.
well, we always did something after work on Fridays, especially. We had a group of our contemporaries, including Warren Morgan and Fred Bolton and some of those era people. And we were much more of a cohesive, knit group in those days. I knew everybody in the Bar Association. They knew me. Today, I think it's so much competition that feelings are not what they were then. We weren't trying to undercut our buddies. So,
Well, today we have very professional civil lawyers who are very pleasant, and then of course we have those who do not play well with others.
right.
But I'm sure you had those kind of lawyers when you were practicing law in the 50s and the 60s, although it was just a handful as opposed to a larger
Yeah, it was
bunch.
just a couple. Hmm.
But everyone knew who they were.
Oh, yes,
And your word was your bond.
absolutely.
Sometimes you did not have to have agreements in writing.
Absolutely. Yep,
A handshake was as good as a signature.
yeah, absolutely.
Now, today, people get concerned about how lawyers are or are not respectful to each other, but same in the courtroom. So after you went on the bench in the Dauphin County Trial Court, did you have any trouble with lawyers being inappropriate or unprofessional?
Not that I can recall. I think once I started, everybody recognized where they were and behaved themselves. I can't remember any specific instances where I had a problem or anything like that.
Did you enjoy sitting on the Dauphin County Trial Court, or was it a tough transition from being a lawyer to a trial judge?
I don't know, it seemed to be easy to do and automatic, I guess. I don't know. Well, I knew what judges did. I had appeared before them and so forth. So it was not a difficult transition.
Who was on the bench with you when you first went on the Dauphin County trial court?
Bill Lipsett was one. Carl Shelley was another. So, there were a number of lawyers who were admitted rather, in adjoining counties, Cumberland, York, and so forth. But, and then if they didn't want to be admitted, they'd have to associate with a Dauphin County lawyer.
How tough was it to get admitted to the Dauphin County bar in those days? Was there a Wilhelm Schisler involved in
Wilhelm Schisler was on the Board of Law Examiners. There was an old senator, I can't remember his name. He was involved. And I'll never forget when I first was, deciding to join the Dauphin County Bar Association. I had to appear before Senator Ernest was his name, Bill Schisler, and I don't know, one or two others. And the first thing they asked me was, who do you know that we know? Which was a political question, I guess.
Of course,
Yeah.
of course. And I know that ended before I started practicing in the 70s, but I understand that sometimes people were not approved to practice in Dauphin County.
I don't remember that. I really don't.
That it was who you knew and the politics, of course, involved.
Well, I think I never heard anything other than the fact that you had to apply, appear before a committee and so forth. And I guess they judged it individually. But I don't have any recollection of people not being approved. I'm sure that happened, but I can't name names at this point.
There were probably very few women and very few non-white lawyers in the 50s and the 60s.
Yeah. Well, in my law school class, there was one woman, and she is dead now, but she practiced in Harrisburg. And there's some older women, Kay Martindale, remember her?
Yes.
And Rose Lehrman, I think. And
Well, I remember talking to Judge Sylvia Rambo, and I believe that there were maybe only one or two in her class when she went to law school.
I think that's
also.
true, yeah. She wasn't too far behind me. I don't want her to hear that.
And Sandra Day O'Connor had very few women in her class.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
When she graduated near the top of her class, the only job she could get was as a legal secretary, and her classmate, Rehnquist, of course, immediately got a job as a lawyer.
Right.
My guess is she was,
A
well,
little bit.
I know she was smarter than he was, but we'll debate that another day.
Yeah. I remember those stories about that. Yeah.
So in the Bar Association, there were very few women lawyers across the state, not just Dauphin County. And do you remember anybody of color that practiced law back then?
Yes, I do. I'm going to try to think of the name.
Was
Well,
Jim Rowland's father?
That's the first one I was going to think of was Jim and his dad. And there was one other whose name I can't think of right now.
And women did not attend Bar Association meetings in those days. Is that true?
That's true.
And I was told that they were sent flowers
Or candy.
or candy.
Can
How
you
did
imagine that?
How did that work?
I don't know. I was never involved in it, but apparently somebody approached him and said, you're a nice person or whatever you would say, but women haven't been attending the Bar Association meetings, but here's a box of candy or something like that. I was never involved in that, but
But they were more or less told you weren't to show up at the Bar Association meetings. Probably they were much too rowdy for the delicacies of a female.
They were some of the annual dinners got a little rowdy. Yeah, they would have speakers from other courts or even one of the appellate courts, and it was rowdy. They would throw buns at the speakers and things like that.
I heard that, and I heard that some men refused to ever return.
I never refused. I enjoyed it, so.
It was fun. And the round table, as I understand it, developed over the years that women also were not invited, but those things all changed in the 90s, I think.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, we never had women at the round table, you know. Well, there weren't, I don't know, there were one or two lawyers maybe, but they didn't get involved in the association much.
So things have changed a little bit. So you practiced as a lawyer
Mm-hmm.
and enjoyed that.
I did, yep,
And then you went on the trial bench in Dauphin County
right.
and were very respected, and I think you enjoyed your time on the bench.
I did very much, yeah.
Is there a particular memory or story or case that you still remember that was either particularly funny or particularly horrible?
Well, you know, in those days, a lot of the stuff was pretty routine. And, you know, I don't have any specific recollection of anything that stands out.
You had a staff of a secretary and a law clerk?
Yeah, I think when I started, I only had a secretary, who, by the way, was with me for 40 years.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Yeah.
And probably didn't do a lot of computer legal research then.
I'll never forget one of the big days in our firm was the day we got an electric typewriter. We go back that far.
Where you had to use the whiteout, and then you had the carbon paper.
Oh, yeah. Used to have to erase the carbon paper, erase and then reprint it, and it always got messed up, you know, it wasn't very nice looking. So,
And bluebacks, you filed everything with what they called a blueback.
bluebacks, yes.
Can you tell us about your memory with the bluebacks?
Well, it was just a blue piece of paper that you folded over the top of the brief or whatever it was and stapled it. That was a blueback.
But it's my understanding you were not allowed to file any document in the clerk or prothonotary's office without that,
That's exactly right, yes.
and it had to be blue.
Absolutely.
Couldn't be beige, couldn't be pink.
Well, I never tried to file anything other than blue, so that could have been.
Well, speaking of colors, is it true the men had to all wear white shirts? They could not wear a shirt with a print on it or a color in court.
Oh, in court? Yeah, basically they wanted a white shirt.
Do you ever
Yeah,
remember
judge.
hearing of judges who would ask lawyers to leave if they didn't have a white shirt?
No, but I can believe it. There was one judge, and the older judges in particular, who had very strong feelings about what attire or what shirt attire male lawyers would wear.
And today, sometimes lawyers show up in sport coats and golf shirts.
Exactly.
That would have been frowned upon, and they would not have been allowed in the courtroom, probably.
They'd have been asked to leave. Yes, absolutely.
And litigants, today litigants show up in my courtroom in shorts and T-shirts.
And jurors, too. Jurors show up in some funny-looking stuff
Did that happen
in those days.
in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s? When did you see that change?
I can't remember when I saw it, but it happened. I think it was pretty far down the road before that sort of thing really became in fashion, because I don't know if the notice to the jurors said that you had to be dressed with this, that, or the other thing. Of course, I didn't get involved in that, but
Right.
as far as I know, it was quite a while before lawyers would come in without a necktie or, so.
And women could not wear slacks. Women all had to be either in skirts or dresses with a jacket to be appropriate attire.
I always thought the women were appropriately attired, so I'm not sure what the rules were for the female lawyers. There weren't many of them in my early days, at least.
Well, in the 90s, there were still judges who would not let women lawyers in the courtroom if they had slacks on. In Dauphin County Court, now you were in federal court, but I'm sure you've heard of
Oh, I've
that.
heard of that, yeah. I can't say that I experienced it, though.
You would not have done that if they were dressed in a pantsuit.
No, I would have, if I felt strongly about it, I might have called them in privately and say, I don't think slacks are appropriate, but I think at that point it was changing and everybody went along with it pretty much.
Got more relaxed about it.
Yeah, very much so.
So when did you decide to go to the federal bench? Did you have an urge to do that? Or was it again, it was suggested to you that you would be a wonderful federal judge?
That I don't know about. I had been on the Dauphin County Court for 12 years when that happened. And in those days, the stuff was kind of things you didn't really like to deal with, custody cases and this, that, and the other thing. And then this vacancy was created. And, I knew Bob Smith and a couple other lawyers who thought it would be a nice thing for me to do. And so I said, okay, I'd like to do that. And in those days, the Republicans, the party was united, and if you ran against a united or a candidate who was endorsed, you didn't get too far. So now that's changed, I think.
Right. But for the federal bench, you're appointed by the president.
Mm-hmm.
Did you first have to appear in front of the United States Senate Judiciary Committee?
I did, yep.
Oh, tell me about that.
You're asking me to remember that. I know how long ago that happened. I remember Strom Thurmond was the chairman of the committee.
Is that right?
Uh-huh. And I think at that point it was either John Hines or Arlen Specter. I don't remember when they were first elected as senators, but the fellow I remember was Strom Thurmond, and he was very nice to me. And it's pretty routine. They would ask you a couple questions. And of course, before you appeared before the committee, you would appear before a staffer, and he would tell you pretty much what's going to happen and what's going to be said and what kind of questions are going to be asked.
They would prepare
They
you
would prepare
pretty
you.
well?
Yeah.
What was your was he a strong personality? In other words, when you walked in the room, you felt his presence? Some people have described him that way, as someone who had a real presence in the room.
Strom Thurmond.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think in those days, even today, anybody who's in that situation, they're impressed by, maybe not favorably, but there's an impression of the person who's in the chairman's seat. It's a big deal.
It was a big deal. Did you get to meet the president then, or had you met him before?
This is an interesting point. I had never met him before, but I was in argument court one day in Dauphin County, and my secretary passed a note up to me. President Reagan called.
Oh my gosh.
And there's a return call number. So I called, I left the courtroom and went down to my office and called this number. The secretary answered, and I said, "This is Judge Caldwell. I'd like to speak to President Reagan." She said, "Just a minute." Next thing I knew, he was on the phone.
Oh my gosh. Did you think maybe it was a crank call at first?
Well, I don't know
Or were you
because.
prepared for the call?
Well, you know, I was kind of prepared because I knew I probably would want to get it.
Right.
But I was not prepared for the call before I got the message in the courtroom that the president had called.
Was your heart pounding? Or
Kind
were
of.
you your calm self as
I
you
don't
usually
remember.
are?
I don't remember my reaction. I'd say it was probably middle of the road. I was excited, I guess, but
I'm sure you were.
I was kind of prepared for it because I was getting a lot of support from.
Did you get to meet the president then
No.
afterwards?
No. Just had one conversation with him, and I had a thing that I could record conversations in my office, you know.
Really?
Yeah, and I knew I shouldn't do that without the consent of the party on the other line. So at some point in my conversation with President Reagan, and early on, I said, "Would you mind if I'd record this conversation?" He said, "Absolutely not," so I pushed the button.
President, I would just like to tell you that in my family, you're an extremely popular and admired person, and we want you to know that you have our full support in your present program to deal with the economic problems of this country. I just wanted to tell you that. Well, thank you very much, and please give your family my best regards. I certainly will, sir, and thank you very much for calling me. All right, thank you. And for the appointment, right. All right.
He said, "Would you do me a favor?"
Is that what he said?
I think so, but
Is
I'll
it?
give you the record. Well, that was early on before I pushed the record button. I think he said, "I want you to do me a favor, do me," anyway.
Isn't that
That's what
charming?
happened.
Isn't that charming? He's known as a charming fellow, so that would go with
Hmm.
his recognized personality.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And then you hung up the phone,
Hmm.
and do you remember what you did next?
Went back to the argument court,
Of course.
which was just going on, you know.
Did you call Judge Morgan or your wife or any other good friend right afterwards?
I don't think I did right afterwards, you know, but I think I indicated to people that I had talked to the president.
Well, I hope you told everybody at the round table, because that would have been a good topic of conversation.
Yeah, I did, I'm sure. I don't remember doing it, but I'm sure I did it.
So then you went on to the federal bench.
Hmm.
And was that a different experience or just a different subject matter?
It wasn't a different experience, but it was different in the sense that they had federal rules of procedure, which you had to get familiar with, and I was somewhat familiar with them. But I'd say day in and day out, it was pretty much the same as a county bench. A lot of drug cases and this and that, you know, so.
Who was on the bench with you when you went up on the federal bench? Was Dix Herman still there?
No, Dix was still alive, but it was his vacancy that I filled when he retired, or he died. He died. Did he die first or not?
But he had been there. And who else was on the bench at that time? Do you?
Well, Bill Nealon and Dick Conaboy. You mean on
Judge
the
Nealon
federal
is
bench?
still sitting, right?
Well, he's retired, semi-retired, I think. I don't
As a
think he's
senior
doing.
judge.
Yeah, he's not doing a whole lot of court work anymore. Neither is Dick Conaboy.
But they're still, I believe, still senior judges, which you were
Yeah.
up until just a few months ago,
Hmm.
still sitting as a senior judge,
Hmm.
which is just remarkable. So that's a lot of years on the bench. Do you remember anything as a federal judge with particular fondness or a particularly terrible case that you had that was really either pleasing or challenging or,
Well, I can tell you about one case
okay?
that was challenging, really challenging, because the lawyers on either side were really experts dealing with patents and trademarks and so forth. The case went on for 5.5 years,
Oh, my gosh.
and it was a fight all the way, and lots of motions and all that thing to handle. And so finally, I set a trial date. Well, I'd set it some time ago. Set a trial date. I said on Monday, March the 3rd, we're going to have a trial. So on Thursday, February 28th, one of the lawyers called and said, "We've settled." I said, "You're kidding. You can't mean it." After all this money that's been spent, and it was two companies that made baby diapers, and they both had patents. I think what they did, they got together and, made some sort of an arrangement where they'd cease fighting, but, make it up in a royalty or some fashion like that. I tried to find out what the terms of the settlement were, and they wouldn't tell me. In fact, Bridget Montgomery was involved in the case for a long period of those 5 years. And I called her after I was told it was settled. I said, "What were the terms of the settlement?" She said, "I don't know."
Well, there were lawyers in a lot of those patent cases from New York City
Oh,
and
yeah.
LA and all over the country, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I remember in this case it was New York, Chicago, the West Coast, maybe another one. But
I believe she was local counsel for one
she
of
was
the
local
firms.
counsel, yeah, for the Kimberly Clark lawyer. And but she played a significant role in those ongoing motions and disputes that we had. And there was a lot of fighting over those 5.5 years.
Well, there was a few pennies involved in that type of a business.
Just a few.
Everybody needs diapers at some point, either for your own children or your own grandchildren or somebody. So it's a hot commodity.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, she's one of the top federal lawyers, litigators, I think, in our area. So,
Mhm.
well, maybe someday I can get the answer for you, and
I wish you
we'll come
would.
over.
You better hurry, though.
We'll share a drink, and I'll just tell
Okay.
you off the record if I can.
That'd be great if you can find out.
The federal criminal trials, as well as the county trials, seem to be more and more involved with drugs as opposed to personal crimes like murders and robberies and those sorts of things. Did you see that change while you were on the county bench or the federal bench?
I think I saw it more on the federal bench because at that time, FBI and some of the other agencies were prosecuting drug cases. They're not doing that much anymore. That's kind of all on a local level as far as I know. But that was definitely a part of the work when I was on the federal bench.
Were you on the bench when they had the Patty Hearst trials?
No.
In the federal courthouse at that time? Because I know that was one of the big interesting cases that had moved to the federal court in Dauphin County, and we also had some of the drug cartels out of Mexico in our federal court here. So although we're only in little old Harrisburg, I think we've had some major federal.
We have had some high dealers go through, absolutely. But I'm sure you find it in the county as well, although maybe not as much as in federal court. I think 96% of our criminal cases end up in a plea, or go to trial. And most of them didn't want to go to trial, most of the lawyers, because I think the federal agencies that handle that sort of thing, they had so much evidence that they shared that the lawyer said, "You've got to plead."
In civil cases, I don't know if many people understand this. When we had civil trials in Dauphin County, when it was jury trial week, we would have maybe 20 pages of cases that were coming up for civil trial. This last week, we had 3 cases on the civil jury trial list. Have you seen that trend on civil jury trials over your time
You
on
mean
the
the
bench?
non-criminal cases?
Yes,
Yeah.
civil cases, yes.
I think, I don't know what the percentage is, very high of the cases that are settled. And there's a lot of civil cases filed that never seem to go anywhere. And we have a lot of dispositive motions to deal with in those cases. And many of them are granted. But I can't really recall much about how many of them actually went to trial. It's a very small percentage of the total filings.
Your philosophy as a judge, as I understand it, is to press the lawyers to move the case forward. And how did you find the best approach to do that was?
Well, when I would get a federal, you're talking about federal cases now? When one would be on my docket, I would have a hearing or a phone call with the lawyers, and we'd set up a schedule, including the trial date, and we'd go through all the lawyers would go through motions and I never had argument court much. I'm not a fan of argument court. I shouldn't say that maybe. But I don't know, we had a lot of numbers as far as civil cases are concerned, but they never took a lot of time for one reason or another.
But you were known as, and maybe you would disagree with this, but you were known as someone that kept everybody on task.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Well, I think I ran my own practice in life on task, and I expected the lawyers to do what they needed to do. Now, we have a lot of continuance as a result of that. And if there was concurrence, I would grant the continuance usually. But if there was not concurrence, I wouldn't, so.
Have you seen cases being handled more promptly now than back in the 50s and the 60s? Do you see any difference in the way lawyers move the cases forward over all of those years? Sometimes cases used to languish for 5, 6, 7 years, and now the rules require that cases move a little more promptly.
That's, I don't have much recollection about that. I would set the schedule and pretty much stick to it, unless there was a legitimate reason why one side or the other would want a continuance, and if there was concurrence, that was fine with me. I wasn't going to fight it. So,
What do you enjoy the most? Reading briefs and making legal decisions, or sitting in the courtroom and handling trials? Or
I
did you enjoy?
like the trials better.
And tell me why.
Well, you're seeing other people. If you're reading briefs in your office, it's not too stimulating or exciting. And when you're in the courtroom, there's a little battle going on, and I just enjoyed it more than the other aspects of the job.
Do you find that now that you have actually retired, you miss seeing the action in the courtroom and dealing with the cases and controversies?
That's a good question. I think when I decided to retire, I thought maybe I've had enough. I think with the Dauphin County Court and the 36 years I was on the federal bench, I think about 48 years in court.
Wow.
So I thought, this is enough. And I was beginning to feel my age too, I think so.
You look not a day over 49.
I'll buy you a drink sometime.
Okay, well, that sounds good to me. Well, thank you so much for sharing your stories with us. I'm going to treasure these times that I've been with you, and all the lawyers just really, really miss you, because you were a judge's judge